happy together. I can't see loving nobody but you for all my life. All right, hello. Back to another lecture. So, we're talking about this time period called the Era of Good Feelings. It's from 1824 to 1840. Is it truly an era of good feelings? Probably not, but there are some distinctions that make historians call it the era of good feelings. So first, it was the rise in mass democracy, where your average citizen was able to vote and have a say in the government more. Of course, you had to be a man and white and all that stuff. Political parties grew to the political party system that we see today. And then President Jackson kind of heralds in this era of good feelings as the president. There were new forms of campaigning, and more people were able to and did vote. So starting when Jefferson was president, about 25% of eligible voters actually voted. Fast forward to the era of good feelings, and you'll see about 75% of eligible voters voted. So that's a pretty big deal. All right. It starts in 1824 with the election, also known as the corrupt bargain. So there were 4 candidates, as you can see here, that there was Clay, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Jackson. You can also notice that where the candidates got support was different for each region. So Andrew Jackson was more to the west, whereas John Quincy Adams is more New England kind of area. All of them claimed to be Republicans, so there was no political party. They all said they were Republicans. But as you can see here, Jackson had the popular vote, but because he didn't win the Electoral College vote, he lost. Back then, this was a weird deadlock thing. So the House of Representatives had to choose the next president out of the top 3, which would have been Clay, Jackson, and Adams. Interestingly enough, Clay was the Speaker of the House, so he's part of the House of Representatives. Eventually, the House of Representatives voted to have John Quincy Adams in, and then Clay became a Secretary of State. A lot of voters and Andrew Jackson himself thought that it was corrupt. Basically, the House said they would give John Quincy Adams said he would give certain members of the House things if they voted for him for president, and that's the only reason he won, whereas Jackson should have been chosen because he won the popular vote. Okay, so then we have the election of 1828. Andrew Jackson ran again. That's him right here. He's also the guy that is on your $20 bill, if you have him. And the Republican Party split in 2. There were the National Republicans, which is John Quincy Adams, the president at the time, and then the Democratic Republicans, which is Andrew Jackson. Jackson portrayed as a frontier man and this everyday man, but that wasn't always true. He did own a plantation and slaves and all that stuff. It was also the beginning of campaigning of mudslinging, which basically means that truths or lies really are used and exaggerated to get voters to change their vote. So you attack someone's character as opposed to their politics. This is basically what happens today all the time. So for example, back then there was a rumor going around that President Jackson's mother was a prostitute and that President John Quincy Adams had a gambling problem, trying to get voters not to vote. You'll see this kind of stuff right here. On election day, though, Jackson got votes from the West and the South, and Adams got votes from New England. Jackson got more votes, won the electoral vote, and became president. So he's a pretty significant president for a few reasons. First, he's the first president, and probably one of the only, who went to his presidency without a college education. So he didn't even go to college, and he's president. He's also the first from the West. A lot of presidents would come from New England or Virginia. He promoted the idea of the common man and wanted the government to be more open and accessible to everyday people. This is also known as populist politics. You're trying to use the people or the masses of the people to get something, and that the elite or the aristocracy, the rich, should not be choosing what happens in the government. For example, in the White House, he would have a block of cheese shown in this picture. The White House would be open to anybody. You could go in, take a little slice of cheese. Maybe he'd come down and talk to you, and it was great. However, the conservative Republicans, or the National Republicans, which was John Quincy Adams, they would call him a king and thought he acted like a monarchy. So he would often say what a government could do, the states had to follow. He kind of didn't listen to what Congress wanted from him. And then one example of this is something called the spoils system, which is when if I were president, I reward my political supporters with public office. So, for example, Jackson's president, anyone who helped him campaign or anyone he owes favors to, he puts them in political office and puts them in positions of power. And he did exactly that to get rid of opponents within the executive branch. It wasn't all peachy for Jackson, though. He had some issues such as the nullification crisis. So it starts here in the South, like South Carolina in that picture. Sorry. They didn't like tariffs or taxes on goods. Tariffs or taxes on goods that are being imported in. The South relied on agriculture and cotton. So they really, really, really relied on imports to get the things that they needed. And when you put taxes on it, it made it more expensive for that state to get things out to consumers. South Carolina said, which means nullification, that you can ignore it and not pay attention to it, that they had the right to not pay attention and to ignore tariffs that were passed by Congress because in the Constitution, a state is allowed to have states' rights in the Bill of Rights. This seems silly, but it is a big deal because it comes up again in the Civil War when the question becomes, can a state have more rights than the federal government or vice versa? Because Civil War states say they have the right to secede or to leave from the Union, and the federal government said they did not. Great. It's just going to begin and continue the discussion about states' rights versus government rights. Jackson was also the president during the Trail of Tears. So his presidency, his campaign was he wanted westward expansion, which meant taking over more land to the west, but that also meant going into Native American territory. Some tribes would follow the path of accommodation and sort of move for them, or move where they wanted them to, like the Cherokees. In 1830, Congress and Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which transplanted different tribes, mainly the Cherokees, who were east of the Mississippi, to new land. And they told they would be permanently freed from white settlement. We obviously know that's not true. The reason the Trail of Tears is significant is it was a very, very, very grueling path for a lot of Native Americans and the Cherokees especially. And a lot of them, hundreds of thousands, died along the way due to weather and conditions and didn't receive much support from the government. So that's one of the starts of our discussions about the U.S. government. I would say it is genocide of the Native Americans. Okay. After Jackson, we see the emergence of different parties. So remember, they were all kind of Republicans, a flavor of that. A new party comes out, and they're called the Whigs. So the Whigs developed due to President Jackson. They were conservative, but they wanted to change the way the government was. They didn't want it to be a monarchy. They also wanted to expand government programs and reforms, particularly to help with the reform movement, so thinking about things with prison, education, infrastructure, stuff like that. They were in favor of a market economy and supported manufacturing in the North and wanted to do anything they could to modernize America. So this leads to the election of 1840. Yes, we jumped quite a bit. So Jackson can't run anymore, so you have a new set of candidates. We have the Whigs and the Democrats, and they were united behind their own candidate. The Whigs candidate, which was William Henry Harrison, was portrayed as a common man in an attack from the Republicans, but in the end it helped them win because it appealed to populist politics and it was named as Parties for the People. This election is important for a couple of reasons. First, it put in this idea that the masses need to be favored, not just the aristocracy or the rich. So this is where you start to see the populist movements start to come up, where it matters the number of people that vote, not who votes necessarily. It's also important because it's the formation of a more modern two-party system that we see today. So even though parties are viewed as not good before, we now have two distinct parties, and they differ in their views on states' rights and the roles of the federal government. This is important because the two-party system is what we have today, but it can and was eventually dangerous. The Civil War began because of two parties' beliefs on the role of the federal government in abolishing and ending slavery. Anyway, hope you liked this lecture, hope you liked the music that I chose, and it'll be a great time for you to take notes on. Alright, bye.